And actually, the following topic matches the first one. Because once you have a startup, once you are working on it, the growth is really important, right?
Yes.
So now we would like to invite the speaker who is working for the amazing accelerator program. Who knows 500 startups?
Well, after this talk, every one of you is going to know 500 startups. So without further ado, I guess, Marvin, please come on stage.
All right, great. Thank you.
Enjoy.
All right. I was like looking around, it's like 5 people know 500 startups? I'm trying to figure this out. All right, so see my slides up? All right. So yeah, here we are. Wonderful. As you can tell, I'm not a designer like Vitaly, but I will hopefully try to make this sort of somewhat interesting and hopefully helpful for you guys. So let's jump into this. All right. All right. Who am I? This is like, the mandatory sort of established credibility slide, right? I've actually lived in, this is a city, San Francisco. I lived there in San Francisco now for probably about 15 years. I'm a partner of 500 Startups, and I'll talk a little bit more about what 500 Startups is. I mentor at about 20 different, actually probably more now, but I mentor at least 20 different startup accelerators across Europe and also the Middle East. I actually serve as a board member or advisory board member for probably 8+ companies. And actually previously, it's interesting doing this presentation after Vitaly, I've actually done the startup thing and the big company suit thing as well too. I spent about 10.5 years at Yahoo, actually before I became a venture capitalist. And so 500 Startups, and what is 500 Startups? I think most people know 500 Startups mainly for Accelerator, and I think I would consider us probably one of the better programs actually globally. But what a lot of people also, I'd say outside the Valley don't know is we're actually a micro VC fund. So we basically invest prior to Series A companies. We've been around for about 4.5 years, and we've invested in close to 870 companies actually in our portfolio right now globally. And 25% of these companies are actually international, not just in the United States. And this guy down here is Dave McClure. He's actually part of the PayPal mafia, been in the Valley for a very, very long time, and my boss, actually. And this is stolen from Vitaly's slide, but this is actually really, really important. And also one thing I want to mention is that prior to my experience actually at Yahoo, I was actually a very early employee back in 1999 at a startup where we actually raised close to $45 million and also proceeded to waste $45 million. And so the company's actually not around anymore. But I learned a lot and talking about failure, right? But it's very different times. And I think if you look at, particularly in the last 5 years, there's been big, big changes in the startup land, and there's been infrastructure. Half that money that we raised was actually to go buy servers and hardware. That's changed. You don't have to do that anymore. You can actually go to Amazon Web Services, and as your business scales, you rent this stuff, right? And on the other side, we spent the other half of that money, which I was in the marketing group, we spent the other half of that money actually spending it in advertising. And that's what's completely different these days is actually there's so many new channels and platforms that you can actually market from, especially internet-driven marketing. There's all, like Google AdWords and Facebook, like where you can reach hundreds of millions of people just from your home, or even things like the Apple Store, right, or Google Play. You can reach millions, in some cases like Facebook or Google, over 1.4 billion people just with these platforms. And that's been a huge, huge change. And that's why VC firms like mine would not have been able to exist really up until sort of the last like 5 or 6 years because of these big trends and changes. But despite that, and this is an awesome book if you have not read this by Ben Horowitz. He's one of the founders of Andreessen Horowitz, one of the best VC firms in my opinion on the planet. Hard things about hard things. Despite that, even though there's been some big changes in startup land, startups are still freaking hard to do. And so if you're doing this because you think you're going to get rich, and my friend Vitaly talked about all the stats, your likelihood of success, even though it's gotten better, are still really, really low. And this is startups, even though they seem sexy from the outside, and you watch The Social Network and all that other stuff, it's not true. It is a brutal, brutal process. So, this is Katerina Flake. She was a founder of Flickr. sold that company to Yahoo. She also founded, I believe, a company called Hunch and was sold to eBay. So a very successful entrepreneur. And really, working on the right problem is more important than working hard. And that's actually really true. And I would even add to this is working on a problem that you feel very passionate about. And hopefully there's a market for that. And there's a lot of stuff that's been covered as well too, of there's real methodology. Unlike when I was doing this back in 99, 2000, there's actual real methodology to building startups now. And these are like awesome books now, not just to investment, but also really building startups. Early stage startups, there's actually methodology. Follow this methodology, most of the time it will limit, I would say, sort of reduce the odds of your failure. Not necessarily reduce failure, but reduce the odds of your failure. But despite that, the most important thing you really have to start with, in my opinion, right, in my humble opinion, is ultimately vision. I funded a company called Shots, and what it is it's a selfie app, right, selfie social network. And you're like, well, why would you do that? Well, besides the numbers, it was growing. It's had something close to, I think it's like about 1 million downloads in 4.5 months, right? Massive, massive growth. And so you're like, okay, the numbers are good, and the retention rates are very, very high, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But what was actually interesting about this and why I funded it was the founding team had this vision. Shots is basically focused on teens, young teens in the US and globally, pretty soon. But focusing on, as a teen, you remember how confused you were, right? And there's a lot of bullying. And they started this thing where it's a social, sort of selfie social sort of network that is all about building positivity and self-esteem. There's no sort of follower accounts. There's no sort of commenting, right? Because a lot of times people use that commenting sort of function to sort of like bully people. So they removed all that. And that's part of the reason I think it's sort of about showing yourself and showing sort of your positivity and showing sort of yourself in the best light. And that's actually one of the reasons, like there's tons of selfie apps, and I think that's actually one of the reasons that I invested in, and also why they've been successful, is because they start off with this vision of like, there's a real problem and a real vision that they're going after. The other thing also to think about, and this is not my concept, it's from my friend James Currier from Ooga Labs, is really think about your language to market fit, right? Everyone hears about product to market fit, but your language to market fit is actually how you describe your product, right? And so there's like lots of dating sites out there, right? So, and the difference is like, finding a date, or is it about helping friends find a date, right? Or other things like photos, and these are little small examples of like, is it about hosting pictures, or is it about sharing pictures, right? And there's like how you describe your product is, and you should be describing your product in the language that your users actually describe it. And one of the tips I give people is that, let's just say you've launched your product, right? You launch your app. The best way to actually see what people are doing is, besides checking customer emails, is actually going and looking at your app store sort of commentary and taking a look at how people are talking about your product, and take that and use that to, for how you describe your product and how you describe what you're actually doing. It's a small little tip, but it actually works incredibly well. I think a lot of times startup founders and folks are too close to your product, and you think like, well, this is why they're using it, or like, here's the benefit. And a lot of times that is not necessarily reflective of the reality. And so really listening to customers and going and looking at this commentary is actually really important. Here it is. Paul Graham, he's the founder of Y Combinator. Ultimately, a lot of times it's about, in the beginning, early stage of your company, he talks about do things that don't scale, right? I have a lot of startups in my portfolio, and a lot of them, for example, are like, say, university-focused startups, right? It's a company called Study Pool. What they did is they literally, the two founders went to like all the different campuses and like plastered like, basically ads like all over the campus. And, that's not necessarily something you can replicate. But in the beginning, you have to go and work on getting your first 50 users, your first 100 users, your first 1,000 users. Like, you don't worry about scaling in the early days. In the beginning, it's about doing things as cheap as possible just to get initial users and to get initial feedback. The other thing is really understanding your stage, right? I think the great thing these days is that there's so many awesome resources, books, blogs, lots of speakers and conferences, and these things are all wonderful. Like, I wish we had this, starting off back when I was starting off, right? But the thing is that you have to be very careful and have a very good filter of really understanding like what stage your company is at, because I would say, you can go and read all this stuff that Dropbox or Facebook is doing now, but frankly speaking, they're like at 1 billion users, right? Like, a lot of what they're doing now is not applicable to what you're doing now, right? If you're an early stage company. So really understanding what stage where arguably you could actually go and look at what they did 4 or 5 years ago. That would be much closer and probably much more helpful. And so a lot of times is especially if you have like mentors and you hear these advisors and people are giving you sort of like feedback or giving you advice, you have to have a good filter of just like, okay, does this person know what they're talking about? And are they giving me advice? Like, for example, I see a lot of corporate people come in this space, and the reality is that a lot of what you learn in corporates, like it took me a long time to unlearn everything I learned at Yahoo to be, in my opinion, a good sort of mentor and advisor for startups. Because a lot of what I learned at Yahoo, I had to unlearn to be useful for startups because they're just different stages. And you guys should have the slides afterwards of just, when you think about it, there's traction stage, right? Figuring out product market fit, then the transition of just when you're going up, and then the growth phase of when you look at really scalable stuff. And so, one of the things that's come out of Silicon Valley, it's like marketing versus growth, right? Marketing is about buying your users and buying customers. Growth hacking is about finding them. And there's a couple of reasons. Growth hacking, this has come out of Silicon Valley for several reasons, right? And all the great companies in Silicon Valley, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Dropbox, you go down the list, right? Pinterest, and these are awesome books. Sean Ellis is a friend of mine. They talk about sort of like lean startup marketing. There's a real process. The whole point about growth hacking is that what they do is that, the best way to describe it, it actually comes from two things. It's actually building a lot of these things into the product, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's a real process of thinking. And this is what makes these companies different. And one of the things is a framework to think about growth is this thing called R metrics. It's actually created by my boss, Dave McClure, of acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and referral. I'm sure folks who've done startup stuff are familiar with this, but this is probably one of the best frameworks on how to think about where you focus on growth, right? So I'll give you an example. I was working with a startup. They raised quite a lot of money, probably about $50 million, and I'm not going to tell you the name of the company, not going to tell you the product that they actually built, but they were spending close to, had something like about 200 million downloads. But what was happening was that they were spending probably close to $150,000, $200,000 a month in marketing. And what we're finding was that people were actually coming to the product, like they didn't have any problems bringing people to their service and downloading their app, but they had a problem with actually people staying. So think about this. Is this success when you have 200 million downloads and you have only like 15 million users on a monthly basis? That's terrible, right? So what was happening is that they were not able to activate and retain a lot of their users. So I remember having this conversation where it's like, why are you spending all this money on sort of bringing new users into a product that frankly is not working very well and that is churning, right? You're not able to activate. I'd rather you go and take that money and go hire either more engineers or better product and actually fix your product before you bring people in. And so a lot of times, I think in the beginning, for a lot of startups, they focus too much on the acquisition side, and they don't really think a lot on, for example, in my opinion, the really hard part is the activation retention side. And what people didn't really understand, like for example, the example I use of Facebook is that in the beginning, beginning days of Facebook, they were bringing a lot of people in, but they found that people were churning out. And they spent like Chamat, who was head of growth at that time, and he built the growth team at Facebook. He basically went to Mark and said, you know what? We need to go and figure out our churn issue, right? Like, so let's stop bringing in users. They spent a year focusing on retention and activating users, right? To make sure when we bring in people, most of these people actually stay on the service and don't leave. Before they actually brought in, sort of like started bringing new users, spent a whole year working on figuring out, doing a lot of tests and running, sort of building, sort of fixing their product. And once they figure out like, okay, when we bring in all these users and they actually stay, now's the time to go and bring in more users, right? To focus on the acquisition side. And so you think about these companies like BranchOut or Vidi, or probably Zynga is another great example where you have these sort of big growth curves, right? But because they did a lot of the right things on figuring out the acquisition, but the things that they screwed up on is the activation retention piece. And so they end up doing the shark tail, right? Massive growth, but people didn't come back, and you'd see these big drop-offs. And this is something to think about, of just think about the R metrics, right? When you're building your product and thinking about your business. And what I was talked about is really growth is a process. It's about bringing scientific experimentation, right? You start with a hypothesis. I think these users are this, right? I think that these channels are going to work. And then you run a lot of tests. And this is a reason why a lot of people talk about growth, but most people don't implement. And you do these like A/B tests. 9 out of 10 of your tests do not work, right? Will not have sort of visible sort of results, or sort of like yeah, I would say like sort of helpful results. But the whole point about this is, and I've met lots of startups where it's like, oh, I did this A/B testing thing, I tried this growth thing, I spent like 2 months building this sort of setting up this A/B test, and I did this test and it didn't really work, right? And the differences were like 0.5. And if you guys are from A/B testing, it's taken from pharmaceutical sales, right? Or pharmaceuticals. One group gets the drug, the other group does not get the drug, and you test the differences. That's what A/B testing is, just in case you know what it is. And this is actually a very standard process. There's a lot of tools now to enable you to do this. And so the whole point about this is like you start with a hypothesis, you go and run these tests, develop some goals, you implement analytics, and then you basically run these tests. And over time, even though you learn little small things about your audience, about your product, over time as you do this, you develop strong competitive advantage and knowledge about your business vis-a-vis your competition. And this is really, really hard to do. But this has become very standard in a lot of the really good companies that you see that are growing right now. And I think Vitaly talked about this, about internet-driven marketing. There's so many awesome platforms out there that reach hundreds of millions of users, right? When I was starting off doing online marketing, I had to go and buy from like about 25 different sites just to get like 10, 15 million users. Now you can use these awesome platforms, right? Whether it's messaging apps to Facebook and Google, and where you could reach over 1 billion people just from your garage, right? Like this has been a huge change. But the problem is these channels change and these platforms change, right? Also stolen from my friend James Currier, about sort of these growth curves, right? So a lot of people, you find these new channels, they work very, very well, everyone jumps on them, and then they start becoming less effective. And so you see these things like, we're going through the growth curve right now of Android as an example, right? But what's happening is that the way you have to think about this now, as these growth curves end off and you don't rely on sort of one channel too much, even though the reality is that in the beginning, most of your growth is going to come from 1 or 2 channels. The way to think about this is, and I like frameworks a lot, is what we call the Bullseye Framework. And this is taken from one of our distribution guys at 500 Startups, a guy named Justin Mayers, wrote a book called Traction. How you think about it is you have this Bullseye Framework, right? So you focus, and this is, Coca-Cola does something similar, 70-20-10. 70% of your time and money and budget is on things that work, right? Channels that work, it could be Facebook, it could be Google Ads. Then you have like 20% of your time and budget on sort of the next sort of emerging sort of channels. And you spend 10%, your experimental budget, stuff that if you try it and it doesn't work, who cares, right? But you learn, right? That's the whole point about doing this. So you're not reliant on just one channel or platform. Another one, this is also another way to think about it, is what we call the Barbell Framework. And this is taken from Andrew Chen, who's also a mentor at 500 Startups. It's basically was taken from financial services, right? So financial services, if you manage your portfolio, the way you think about it, just like how you put your time and energy into certain channels, is that you have a barbell. On one side is like bonds, right? Things that work for sure and they're never going to lose their money on. And the other side are risky things like venture capital or stock, things that have higher potential of ROI but also higher potential of failure. But this way, using the barbell, either whether you decide to use a Bullseye Framework or use a Barbell Framework, this allows you to not be too dependent on one channel and one platform. So what happens, for example, and that's one of the reasons like Zynga started going downhill, is that they were overly reliant on Facebook as a channel. Like they grew like crap. Facebook changed the algorithm, and then basically their traffic dropped off, and they had big problems in their business after that. That was one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one big reason. And so when using these frameworks and this methodology allows you to be not overly reliant on one platform. Right? The good thing too, lots and lots of analytical tools out there that are cheap that anybody can use, right? At Yahoo, and even my previous startup, and I was an early employee, we had to go and bug engineers, right, to go and build these things. Now there's so many off-the-shelf tools that you can use and implement right away, whether it's Google Analytics or things like Optimizely or Unbounce, awesome tools that you should use right now for this testing methodology, all right? And one thing, if you get anything out of this, many of you guys are students. This really changed my life, right? Pareto's Law, right? Have you heard of Pareto? Right? He was an Italian economist, and he talks about the 20-80 rule, right? So 20% of lawyers make 80% of the income, right? And the same thing with your company and your business. 20% of your customers are going to drive 80% of your revenue. And this is really, really a powerful law. And the same thing, 20% of the thing that you spend the most time on is going to give you sort of 80% of the returns. And your goal, and I think as a student, as a business person, is to figure out what these 20% things are that drive these 80% results. I learned this, like I would say, relatively late in my life, and understanding sort of what I was good at and what I really enjoyed and what I derived pleasure from, and making sure that fit with this, and I realized if you map these things, it's like, wow, like if I just focus on these things, that's going to drive the majority of the results. And there's an inverse to this, right? 80% of your customers are going to give you 20% of your revenue. And so that makes you think, it's just like, wow, should I even have these customers, right? Because they're sometimes a pain in the ass to work with. And so understanding how you use your time and your resources. And this is also the same thing with channels, right? 20%, one or two of your channels are going to drive most of your business and most of your marketing results. All right. And one of the things we think about, at 500 Startups, as a firm, as an accelerator, is culture and community really, really matters, right? When you think about growth, this is something that the entire company needs to be supportive of. And we think about this a lot. Have CEO being supportive, is engineering being supportive. This is not something specific just to marketing, right, or to the growth team. This is something everybody needs to believe in, and this is something that all the best companies they follow this, and it's entrenched in their culture from the beginning. And ultimately, it's about having balanced teams. This is really important, and this echoes a lot of what Vitaly mentioned earlier. The hacker, the hustler, and the hipster, right? Design is really, really important, and also engineering. And this is actually one of the big challenges, in my opinion, for startups and startup culture in most places. I'd say particularly in Central Eastern Europe is, I would say, and this is one of the benefits in most of Eastern Europe. I would say engineering, tech talent. Awesome tech talent. And I would say Baltic, Scandinavia, certain parts of Western Europe, design is really, really amazing. The one thing that most of the region, and I would say this is even inclusive of Canada, where I'm originally from, of startup culture, is just sales and marketing sucks. That's actually the reason I actually moved to the US to learn sales and marketing. And having these sort of blended, balanced teams is really, really important, right? And we you hear this a lot, where I think there's just, in startup culture, even in Silicon Valley, I think there's too much focus on like sort of this, if you build it and they will come, right? Like, all I need is just a good product person, good engineering, and then my business will grow. That's crap, right? If you can have an awesome product, but it's like if nobody knows about it, doesn't help you at all right? But ultimately, it's about making stuff that people want. This sounds really, really simple, but it's really hard. And I think one of the great things now, there's all these growth tactics, and there's tons of blogs and books and techniques and tactics you can use to grow. But ultimately, if you're not fixing a problem and fixing your users' and customers' real problem, and you're using these growth tactics and things, all you're doing is spamming them, right? So ultimately, it comes down to make a good product and make sure that there's something that people actually want, and that's what lean methodology and all these other things actually are. But the good news is, this is simple but hard to do. But at the beginning, this is just half the battle, right? And so hopefully this was a helpful presentation. I think I'll be doing a workshop later on, at least more Q&A, and I'll be walking around later on today because I don't think we have time for questions. Do we have time for questions, or do we have time for questions? Do we have time for questions? Yeah. And so hopefully this was helpful. Thank you very much for listening. Do you have questions? Anybody have questions? I don't know what timing. You guys are the boss. I do whatever you ask me to do.
Well, what typically happens in Lithuania is everyone's like, oh, I have no questions. And once the presentation's over, everyone runs to you and they're like, oh, I actually had one question. So I think we're going to ask you to come down from stage, and everyone's just going to run and chase you, and then asking questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.